Today, I'm going to share 5 do's and don'ts that you need to know if you want to make good beats. I've reviewed and helped fix thousands of beats for my subscribers and my course members, and there are some common mistakes I see over and over. And these are mistakes that you might be making right now, which are causing your beats to sound worse. So let's go over them. I'm going to be using my subscribers' beats as the examples in this video. If your beat shows up here, don't feel bad. I've made many of these same mistakes when I first started making beats as a young baby. Anyways, let's start by listening to our first beat by Sir Trips-a-Lot. And by the way, while you're at it, hit like and subscribe. It really does help me out, and I love making these types of videos, so if you want to see more, let the algorithm know. So the mistake that this beat is making is probably one of the most common ones that I see. There is one particular frequency space that producers often miss, and it causes their beats to sound empty and hollow. So if you ever made a beat that sounds this way, missing frequencies could be a problem. You might be wondering which frequency space is missing. It's the low mid frequency space. You can even see this if I open up an EQ and take a look at this beat. Here we have presence in the higher and mid frequencies. In the low end, we have presence with the bass as well as the kick routinely playing. But you can see right here, we have this pocket of frequencies that's missing. There's a dip in this beat that we can see visually. And filling up this frequency space is really important. It's often what makes your beat sound full and complete. For example, take a listen to how this beat sounds before and after I add a layer that resides in this frequency space. It's pretty noticeable how much more full this beat sounds now. Oftentimes this frequency space is where your chords will sit, which is exactly what I built to fill up the space, as you can see. But here is a bonus tip for you. If you run into this problem while using a sample and you don't know what chords to build, try isolating an open part of the sample and use halftime on this layer. And this halftime layer can help you bring some presence into that right frequency space, as you can see on this EQ. Next, let's move on to a beat by Sab. By the way, if you like this kind of in-depth tutorial, I should let you know that I have a full online beatmaking course called Better Beatmaker. It basically shows you every single do and don't at every single step of the beatmaking process, which will help save you years instead of going through trial and error all on your own. Members tell me it's the best course they've ever joined, and it's even helped some members start working with artists just months after they started making beats, which is crazy because it took me years to get that good. The link should be showing up somewhere on the screen right now if you're interested. Back to Sab's beat here. You might have seen some YouTube tutorials on how to build your own bass line, where it will tell you to figure out the root notes of your sample and follow those root notes to build out your bass line. For example, this sexy young gentleman here, I don't know who that is, but he's basically telling you to do the exact same thing that I just said. The problem with this advice though is that it only applies to certain types of samples, ones that have instruments in the low-mid presence that we talked about from the first example. In that case, following the root notes of those lower frequency instruments will give you your basic framework to build your bass line. The issue with this sample though is that Sab is doing this exact same approach to this sample, which is actually meant to be more of a melodic sample. Sometimes you're going to come across samples like these that are meant to be more to provide the melody of your beat, and you have the responsibility to build your own progression underneath, just like we did in the first example. And so that's exactly what I did here. Now that I have this built, I can use the root notes from this pattern and apply the exact same bassline approach that you've probably seen in many YouTube tutorials to make something that just sounds better. And from here, I could complicate my bass line if I wanted to. So make sure you apply the correct method when building out your bass line, and make sure you understand what your sample is actually providing in your beat. The next beat that we're going to be looking at is by The C. Andrew. Now this beat sounds okay for the most part, but the interesting thing happens later on if we take a listen. We have a big jumbled mess of sounds and patterns. This is something that I commonly see when producers make beats. Because their beats sound so minimal, it sounds so incomplete, they think that adding more and more musical patterns and instruments is the solution to this problem. And they end up adding layer after layer to fill up their beat. The patterns that they build don't really work with one another, and they end up making their beats sound worse and worse with every new sound. But what they might be overlooking is just how much space your drums and your bass can help take up in your beat. By being smarter with your drums and your bass, you can instantly make your beats just sound so much more full, so you don't have this problem of having to add a million patterns just to make your beat sound full. For example, here's how the beat sounds with the original producer's drums along with the main loop. Now take a listen to how much more full this beat sounds if I use more colorful drum sounds and create more of an elaborate pattern. These drums don't even have any processing on them, and they still sound large and they fill up the beat quite a bit. And you might have also noticed that the original beat didn't have a bass line either. And so once I add these bass textures into the beat, it just sounds even more full. So make sure you don't underestimate how valuable drums and bass can be. They might not be the most exciting sounds to add, but they can be so helpful when making your beat sound actually complete. And the final beat that we're going to look at has two main problems. It's a beat by Corrupt Footage, so let's take a listen here. A really cool sample for sure. I like how this loop sounds, but the problem occurs once the additional layers get added in. Now this is the first common problem that a lot of producers have who are a bit inexperienced with using samples, which is getting the samples timing to line up with their own sounds that they add into their beat. So let's go over a few different ways to do this so that no matter what kind of sample or beat you're making, you'll be able to use samples a lot better. Let's go over scenario number one. Let's say you're using a sample and you don't know what BPM it is. This is going to be the very first thing that you're going to want to figure out. And the way you're going to do this is by opening the BPM counter that comes with your beat making program, or just going to Google and searching for one online. And what you're going to do is just simply click your mouse every single time your head nods as you listen to your sample. If you're a regular human being and not some sort of alien who doesn't understand rhythm, it's basically as simple as that. So let's open up our BPM counter, and here we go. So it looks like 132 is our first estimate. Now that you have a rough idea, let's double check if this is right. What you're gonna do next is use your cutting tool to cut out a perfect loop from your sample that sounds flawless as it loops around. Let's find a starting point for our loop and make our first cut there. Then listen to the sample again and figure out where the loop ends and starts over, and make a cut there too. And now that you have both of these cuts, hopefully this loops around perfectly. Alright, looks like we got it on the first try. If you do this exact same process and it does loop around perfectly, but you notice you have a bit of a tail sticking out like so, or the loop isn't long enough, it's because your BPM is slightly off. So just simply adjust the BPM until your loop fits perfectly onto the grid. A final check that you can use is to turn on your metronome, and if it sounds good on beat, then you're good. And now that you got your loop ready, you can add your own sounds in and make your own beat. But let's move on to scenario number 2. Let's say you wanted to make a beat at a very specific BPM. So here I'll change my beat's BPM to 120. And as you can see, my perfect loop just does not fit on grid and it ends prematurely. So if you have a sample or loop that you want to fit into a specific BPM that's different than what your sample currently is, you're gonna have to stretch it. Double-click the sample and change the mode to stretch. Turn on stretch mode and stretch it so it fits perfectly into the grid line. I do want to point out this is partly why I advise using an actual sampler if you want to sample though. All this becomes much easier. You just create one single chop and it auto stretches and adjusts no matter what your BPM is. But there's one more mistake that I want to point out in the original beat. If we replay it, you can hear. The drums are just not programmed correctly, and this is most likely due to the producer not understanding the difference between double time and single time. So here's a quick rough guide. If your BPM is higher than 100, you are most likely working in double time. In that scenario, you would place your snare on the 3 and the 7 like I did. If your BPM is lower than 100, you are most likely working in single time. What you basically want to do here is squish your drum pattern so the snares sit on the 2 and the 4. And so from the sounds of it, the beat's original drum pattern was probably made in a single time format with the snares on the 2 and the 4, but the beat's BPM was in double time range, resulting in an insanely busy drum pattern. So make sure you understand what BPM you're in. If your drum pattern sounds weirdly busy and super fast paced, you've probably made an error in programming your drum pattern. But there are a lot more common problems that your beats might have. The video showing up on the screen right now covers the 5 most common red flags that show up in a lot of producers' beats. I really recommend checking it out, and by combining what you've learned in this video, you'll be making better beats in no time. So click the video. Come on.